Well, I bet a lot of you thought that I was just going to skip over this story, that either I was going to pretend it doesn't exist or that I missed it because of all the Fed news this week, but no, I just haven't had a chance to get to it until today. And that is Trump's apparent falling out with Bibi Netanyahu, which I have to say, reading this, even though this is a way incomplete story, we're not getting nearly enough context, we're not getting nearly enough details. The overall picture that's being painted seems to be that Trump got a wake-up call after he was elected president, while he was president, that old Bibi Netanyahu isn't the great American ally that he's cracked up to be by all of conservative media. I guess there's this guy who works for Axios, apparently, or at least was publishing these little excerpts in Axios, who is writing a book about the Abraham Accords, and he interviewed Trump in April of this year, I think, for 90 minutes, and essentially talked to him about all this stuff and about his relationship with old Bibi Netanyahu. And I have to say, it's great. Trump has the ability to get away with saying things that nobody would ever be allowed to say, Republican or Democrat. And he has a way of neutralizing these radioactive topics. One of the things that you just never were allowed to question was our federal government's loyalty and deference to not only Israel in general, but Bibi Netanyahu in particular. And Trump, it's funny, as someone who was, a pretty, an outsider to politics, he didn't have a very deep understanding of these things. He naively thought that, what he was told about Bibi was true. And he said, well, everybody always told me the Israelis wanted peace, so I thought, hey, if I make a peace deal, they'll be happy about that. And he said he was talking to Netanyahu. He had conversations independently with Netanyahu and Abbas. And Abbas is, it's not fair to call them equals. Abbas is definitely not an equal of Netanyahu. But, for the purposes of these talks, Trump wanted to kind of treat them as equals, and so he talked to Abbas as the, de facto Palestinian leader, even though he hasn't, I think the last time he won an election was 2005, and he only, I think the only constituency that voted in that election was the West Bank, anyway, which is only one of the two Palestinian territories. But, for what it's worth, Trump treated Abbas as, hey, de facto Palestinian leader. And he treated, Netanyahu as Israeli leader. And so he sat down and he talked to both of them. And he said to his face, Abbas was very nice, got along well. He thought, hey, I could make a deal with this guy. And then he talked to Bibi, and he said to Netanyahu's face, you don't want to make a deal, do you, Bibi? And he went, these are Trump's words. He just sort of stumbled and got all flustered. And it's just amazing to me that Trump, being, so naive, he was able to say that. And because he was genuinely surprised. Because he's like, hey, I was always told the Israelis want to make a deal. So I thought, this will be easy. I just have to get the Palestinians on board. And after he talked to Abbas, he's like, this Abbas guy seems pretty reasonable. Now, he didn't expect that Netanyahu was going to be the tougher one. And obviously, and Trump even said this, because of domestic Israeli politics, it didn't seem like it was in Bibi's best interest to try and make a deal. It's like, oh my gosh, Trump, you're saying all these things that, we alleged anti-Semites who question, the great innocence of Israel. Those of us who say, hey, we're not necessarily big fans of the Palestinians, but we can see how the Israelis are not angels. The kinds of stuff that we have been, noticing for a long time. And as we all know, when it comes to Israel, there's a lot of things that you're not allowed to notice. Trump just comes right out and says them. Like he doesn't know that you're not allowed to say these things. Of course Netanyahu doesn't want a deal. Of course Netanyahu doesn't want a two-state solution. What's in his best interest is furthering the status quo. Because he knows he can't just annex the West Bank and Gaza and make those two areas Israel. Because then he would have millions of new Arab citizens in Israel who while they would not be a majority of Israel by any means, they would be a huge voting bloc. They would be a very substantial minority. And it would be a pretty divided state. It would no longer be an overwhelmingly Jewish state. It would be sort of a mixed Jewish and Muslim and Christian state. But at the same time, Israel's been holding on to Gaza and the West Bank for decades and decades and decades, and they don't want to just let them go. They just want to kind of slowly starve out the Palestinians, hope that, they move out of the country to some place where they have more opportunity and where they have, more rights, get out of there and move to Jordan or Syria or something, or Lebanon. The Queen of Jordan is a Palestinian. She got out of there. She's much better off. And I think people like Bibi in Israel would like all the Palestinians to kind of follow in her footsteps. And so they've got the tiger by the tail. They don't want to let him go because then they lose all that land. And, there's been a huge, certainly if you spend enough time in conservative media here in America and over, maybe not in recent years, in the last couple of years, but certainly for, much of the time I was growing up, the West Bank in particular is considered to be sacred. And for evangelical Christians, this is, that's a part of the Holy Land, and it must be controlled by Israel and all this. But the problem is the people who live there are not the kinds of people who Israel wants to make up its citizenry. And so they can't make a deal where they give the West Bank, as it is, the parts of the West Bank that are still Arab and Gaza. They can't give too much autonomy to these places. They can't make a deal with them, treat them as their equals. They can't do something like Bosnia, where you have Republika Srpska and then the Muslim Croat Federation, two separate governments governing these different little towns in Bosnia. Because at some point, the Israelis want the whole shebang. It's just that they can't have it right now. And so they have to just keep preserving the status quo, eating away at the Palestinians little by little, building new settlements or townships or whatever they call them. And eventually, this archipelago of Israeli settlements can be connected, and they can squeeze out what little Arab civilization is left. Whereas the Palestinians, they're constantly losing ground here. So they're incentivized to make a deal. They want to consolidate what they have left. They don't want to, because they've seen over the decades, they just get more and more losses. They lose more and more territory, and Israel expands bigger and bigger. And so it makes sense that you could find Palestinians who are like, yeah, let's make a deal right now. Let's take these penciled in lines that Israel keeps erasing and moving, and let's draw them in with Sharpie. Fine, let's do that. Because at least then we'll be able to keep our homes that we still have. We understand, we're not in a position to take back, everything that we've lost since 48. If you're a Palestinian, we understand that all those villages that were raised after the Nakba, where all the, I don't have time to get into it, but where you have all the vast majority of all the Palestinians who lived in within what is now Israel proper, when they were essentially driven into countries like Lebanon and Syria and Jordan as refugees. The old Palestinian refugees, we don't talk about them too much anymore because most of them have died of old age by now. But all those people, all their houses, their villages, their farms, they're gone. They've been erased. Israel's built new towns, and they're not coming back. And so, if you're a Palestinian in 2021 living in the West Bank, you recognize that. And you say, you know what, I at least want to keep my town, and I want to keep my house. And so I want to stop, freeze the encroachment of the Israelis, give them what they want, give them whatever they have right now. Let's just keep this in play. And Trump found that out firsthand through experience. And it's amazing because, like, once that bell can't be unrung, because Trump now kind of feels betrayed because all these people told him, but, I thought the Israelis wanted peace. I thought they wanted to make a deal. And then he realizes, oh no, politically that doesn't make sense for them. Their interests don't line up with that. And now so that story I find very interesting. And how Trump just does not like Bibi at all. Apparently Bibi tried to reconcile with him and all this, and Trump is just not happy with him. And to be honest, I wouldn't be either if I were in Trump's position. If I went in with a certain understanding of Netanyahu, and then I found out that understanding was untrue, I would no longer be happy with him. Now, there's another story, which we don't have enough information about. Did not make sense to me. But the gist of it was that Trump is mad at Netanyahu and feels like he used him in the assassination of Soleimani. Now, in the interview, apparently Trump defends his decision to assassinate Soleimani and says, well, he was there meeting with these Iraqi militias to plot, attacks against Americans. They weren't there to talk about child care, I think was the phrase that Trump used. He was up to no good, and so I don't feel bad about killing him. But he said that he felt used, like Netanyahu used him in that. I don't know what he means by that. I mean, if he felt used, I would think that would mean that he does regret killing Soleimani. Because, the idea there, if I were thinking, why would he regret it? Or why would he feel used? It was because he would feel like the U.S. was used just to take out an enemy of Israel, someone who was not necessarily an enemy of America, which I would say, Soleimani was certainly an enemy of Israel. I think that it's up for debate whether or not he was an enemy of America or a threat to him. It certainly wasn't a threat to America, but was he even an enemy of America? I think that's questionable. Was he a great guy? I think there's probably a lot better people in the world, but he fought ISIS, and ISIS, those were pretty bad guys. I think it's pretty safe to say ISIS was worse than Soleimani. And considering he played a great role in cleaning up the ISIS mess, which, for those who may not remember, was created by the U.S. government. They are the ones who allowed ISIS to get out of hand. Now, there was a very interesting line in the headline of this article, which unfortunately is not a quote attributed to Trump, but it was that Netanyahu was willing to fight Iran to the last American, which is pretty funny. This was apparently some senior Trump aide, though. I'm not sure who that was, but I would have liked... at first, when I read this, I thought Trump himself said that, and I'm like, oh my God. But alas, it was not him. But if that's somebody close to Trump, I would imagine Trump probably would be amenable to that perspective. He would understand it. Because that really is the case. Iran, not a huge, not any threat to America, certainly. They're not even a big enemy. We could probably make friends pretty easily with Iran, I would think. But Israel and Iran, they're probably not going to be friends. And if you're Israel, does the idea of going to war with Iran on your own, does that sound like a very good idea? I don't think so. I don't think I would want to do that if I were in Israel. Israel's pretty tiny. They don't have really an ability to get soldiers to Iran. And Iran itself, geographically, very large country. It's an ancient empire. So they've amassed a pretty sizable territory, and the terrain is not really conducive to an invasion from the west. A lot of mountains and rocks and things, and it's hard to get through if you're little tiny Israel, or if you're even big strong America. I've talked about this before, back when there were Iran war scares in the past, that it would not be a great idea for the U.S. to go to war with Iran. It would not go well. It would be much harder than Iraq, and of course the U.S. lost the Iraq war. But an Iran war would be much, much more difficult. So, conclusions from all this. I think if Trump were to get back into office, he would be much more skeptical of Israel going in, and would maybe make a little better decisions. Because it seems like, he was caught off guard a lot. He really didn't know much about this situation going in. But once he saw what was going on, he seemed to come to a pretty reasonable conclusions. And so now he might have a bit more of a mature and developed idea of the situation. So I'm not going to say that Trump would be great on the Middle East if he were to be elected again, but I'm just saying he probably would be better than his first term. And going into his first term, he was already much better than Bush or Obama. He was at least pretty skeptical about wars in the Middle East. But his weak spot was Israel. Was like, oh, but Israel's great. But now he's like, hey, these Israelis seem to want us to fight wars for them, and that's not very America first. Fighting Iran to the last soldier is not fighting Iran to the last American is not very America first. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.